Alright, so in this video I'm going to explore two things. One is a K8Spin. It's a nice new service. It provides a namespace as a service. So basically, just by creating an account, I get a Kubernetes namespace and I could install stuff on it. So it's like a GKE, but simpler. And I'm going to use Gimlet. I'm going to configure Gimlet so I can deploy things, applications to this K8Spin namespace. So I already created my account. It's basically just a GitHub OAuth flow, and I created a namespace. And in their free tier, I got 100 millicores and 128 megabytes of RAM. It's just enough for my purpose in this demo. And I already downloaded the kubeconfig as well. So I pushed this button and I took this file and merged with my usual kubeconfig things. And yeah, it's quite straightforward. There is also a domain configured, a wildcard one. So if I would install an ingress controller in this namespace, I would have a domain name. Let's just do a ls lookup on this one. Yeah, it points somewhere. The domain name exists, so that's good. And let's just look at this namespace I have from K8Spin. And looks like it is empty. And okay, I cannot list the namespaces, and I expect the same from nodes, so I only have this narrowed down view on the namespace. But that's what I just need, so that's perfect. So, what next? So Gimlet. With Gimlet, we will be able to deploy applications rather easily to this namespace. You don't have to fiddle with Kubernetes manifest files, and we will have a nice feature set out of the box. So for Gimlet to operate, it needs a GitHub app. So the integration is going through this GitHub app, and each Gimlet user will have their own app, primarily because Gimlet will be available as a self-hosted version as well. So if you self-host, you probably don't want to have a single point of failure or a single point of access that is not in your control. So you have to create a GitHub app, but there is a template for that, so it's going to be rather simple. I just created the app just like that, and I have to install the application on my own personal account. There are a bunch of OAuth permissions, and I'm only going to enable this Gimlet app to just certain repositories. I'm just going to pick my personal website. All right. So Gimlet will write the code, but that's only going to be to the GitOps repository, access metadata. I'm not sure what metadata is really, and going to read and write commit statuses, deployments, and hooks. And when people are going to log in to Gimlet, we are going to read their email addresses. So I'm going to install this application, and so the application is configured in Gimlet. Now I have to log in through GitHub, so that's another authorization screen, and I will authorize Gimlet. All right, so here is Gimlet's main view after the brief installation. There is this single repository that I granted access to Gimlet. And for this whole thing to work, this Gimlet thing is GitOps. So it's going to need a GitOps repository where it can store the manifest files. And I have to create a Git repository on GitHub and set it on the settings page. So that's the text box we have to fill. So I'm going to go to GitHub and create a new repository. I'm going to call it GitOps K8Spin, and it's going to be a private repo, and that's it. I create the repo and steal this name, which I'm then going to save in Gimlet. Cool, so the settings are updated, and I just navigate to the root. Looks like the repo does not exist on GitHub, which is odd because I just created it. However, since our GitHub integration was rather narrowed down or constrained into just a selected few repositories, I think I have to go to actually I could navigate from settings. I have to go to the application, and I have to grant access to that newly created repository. I'm going to edit the installation, and I will select the GitOps K8Spin repository. I press save, and I hope Gimlet will just realize the access after a refresh. And cool, so I think we are all set. Fingers crossed, like super crossed. It's early days with Gimlet, but I think it's just going to work. If I go to the website and I want to configure it, it says that there is no Kubernetes environment configured, which is fair, because for Gimlet to operate, it needs an agent. The agent will run in the target deploy environment in your cluster, in our case in the K8Spin namespace, and it's going to monitor resources and upstream certain data to the Gimlet server, so it could provide real-time state of your cluster, and also monitor the deployments and so on. So let's go to the settings page, and let's set up an agent. As currently there are no connected agents, and we can add a new agent by configuring a piece of YAML with the help of these text boxes. And I think let's start with the namespace, because that's fairly straightforward. If we go back to K8Spin into the console, then we can copy and paste the namespace name, which is going to be this one. And so that's going to be the namespace, and we can set the name of the agent or the environment, and that's going to be test. You can call it staging or production or whatnot, and this would be fine if you have the whole cluster for yourself, but if you only operate Gimlet, or you only deploy with Gimlet to just a single namespace, you can define your namespace with an equals sign. So the test environment is going to be this namespace. And by the way, if you want to have multiple target environments or multiple Gimlet environments in one cluster, you can start up multiple agents with a similar setting. So test equals namespace A, and then production equals namespace B. But right now we only have a single environment in this namespace. Let's copy the YAML and put it into a file. And if we scan through this YAML, we can see a couple of things that actually needs to be changed for K8Spin. If you would have the whole cluster for yourself, then this would be perfectly fine. But as you can see, there is a cluster role binding right here. So for Gimlet to work in K8Spin, let's remove the service account and the cluster role binding, because we don't have permissions to set up roles across the cluster. And then the another bit that we have to change is the service account name, because in the K8Spin namespace there is a service account made for us, which has the necessary permissions. So just by doing these modifications on the Gimlet YAML, we have an agent configured. We can just deploy it right now. So how about just applying this this YAML file, which is Gimlet agent YAML. It's configured and it's being created right now. It's now pulling the images and it's already running. So if we look at the logs, we can see that the test agent is initialized in this namespace and the initial state was sent to Gimlet. So everything seems to be fine, and if you scroll upwards, you can already see that the connected agents list has your test environment. So we have an agent, we have an environment. If you go back to the website, Git repo, we can configure that now. The namespace, we know this. Again, for this demo, I don't really have a Docker image built, so I'm just going to use my trustworthy nginx on a logged down version. Container port is 80. I'm going to skip the rest for now. This is the more concise configuration of your deployment, your Gimlet YAML. So I just save this one and go back on the repository site. There is one last step, because the agent is now able to stream all the changes up to Gimlet. So this is the real-time view that I don't have anything deployed. We need one more component because Gimlet uses Flux. It's an open source project from Weaveworks, and Flux is responsible for pulling down configurations or manifests from the GitOps repository. And basically, Gimlet tells me to clone my own GitOps repo, which I'm going to do now, and I should apply this configuration to bootstrap Flux. And in a regular cluster, we can do that, but Flux also has the similar situation as with the agent, that it uses a cluster-wide service account, and it also wants to set up service accounts. So if I deploy to K8Spin, I need to tailor this deployment somewhat. So if I open the GitOps repository, I can find Flux being staged for the test environment. And the customization YAML points to a base, which is in the config folder. So my goal is to remove the cluster roles and the bindings from this deployment. And this is a one-off task. On a regular cluster, this wouldn't be necessary. But right now, with this pair, K8Spin and Gimlet, we have to do this one-time setup. So it points at to a service account that is not needed anymore. So I just remove this line from the base config. And the customization deals with some cluster role bindings, which is not necessary at all. And there is a JSON patch overlay on the cluster role name. Now, I don't have a cluster role anymore, but I have to change the service account name. So I'm going to reuse this patch overlay to target my Flux deployment. So it's going to be a deployment with name Flux in our namespace, which is, I always forget, this is our namespace, and it's going to be a new overlay, service account name. Making a copy of this one. So we are not replacing the name, but instead we are replacing this service account name inside spec, template spec. So let's write this here. And the service account name is this. So I think this is all what's needed for our Flux installation to not use a service account. So let's make a commit. Patch Flux to not use cluster-wide service account. And once this is done, I can just follow the instructions here. So I cloned the repo, I made some one-off changes, and I'm going to install Flux now that it's there. So let's just look at the pods one more time and then install. Cool. This looks okay, and the container is being created, and it's running already. And let's see, it should start polling the GitOps repository. All right, it found some changes, which it will roll out. So this looks good, right? Or is it? I think it does. As for speed, on K8Spin, the trial account contains 100 millicores, and I wanted to fit into that, but it turns out that Flux needs a little bit more of that. Maybe not on the CPU front, but in memory. So with the 100 millicores comes 100 megabytes of memory, and the two pods do not fit into the trial version. The Gimlet agent is somewhat smaller, but Flux needs more resources. All right, so our last warning just went away, and our app is configured. So how about deploying this version and crossing fingers that it will work? So now it's being deployed. The manifests have been updated. This is the GitOps change, and soon Flux will realize that it has to update and deploy everything. The first time it's a bit slower than the subsequent items, because Flux also needs to enable that it needs to basically reconfigure itself, so it watches a new folder for this application. So let's look at this GitOps change. There are a bunch of configs for my deployment. There is the new release for this deployment, and this is the reconfiguration. So essentially Flux redeployed itself, added a new path on the GitOps repo. So by the time I think we go back, this could be up and running. It is not, so I'm just gonna look at the pods running, and okay, so I was a bit too eager. It's applying things right now. I'm using some service requests and limits that maybe limit down Flux a bit too much. So I'm using 100 millicores maximum to Flux. So maybe I can raise that to 200 or even more. All right, but the deployment is there, so that's pretty cool. Things work, and if I just deploy one more time, the GitOps update just happened. This time only just one annotation is updated, and in non-demo cases, so real cases, also the image hash is what's updated in this case. And by the time I'm here, we can see the last pod being shut down. So things work. So that's great. I think I will wrap the video right here, and what I am going to pursue related to this integration is changing Flux's service or resource settings, so it's going to be a little bit faster, and gonna check with the K8Spin guys what they think, and maybe make an option for Flux to run without a cluster wide service account. So that's that. Thanks for watching.